Welcome to another CME podcast episode from NEI, the Neuroscience Education Institute. In today's CME episode, Dr. Andrew Cutler will be interviewing Dr. Roger McIntyre about the most current research on the brain-gut connection. For complete CME information, please refer to this podcast description page or go to nei.global/podcast. Let's listen in as Drs. Cutler and McIntyre discuss the brain-gut connection.
All right, well, this is Dr. Andrew Cutler. I'm thrilled to be here with my friend Roger McIntyre. How you doing, Roger?
Hey, Andy. Great to be with you.
Yeah. You know, there's been a lot of interest in recent years about the microbiome gut-brain interaction. And particularly now with the coronavirus and COVID-19 that we're dealing with, I think a lot of people are really concerned about microbiota and germs, if you will, more broadly. So, Roger, maybe you can tell us a little bit about why is this such a hot topic? Why is there so much interest in this interaction?
Well, I think there's a collection of factors that are really directing us towards the possibility that the gut-brain axis might be relevant both to how we conceptualize what causes mental disorders and perhaps maybe how we prevent and treat them. First is we all recognize, not just as clinicians, but as advocates of our patients and this population, the extraordinary burden of illness that mental disorders collectively exact on the population. And unfortunately, patients, families, and all of us as clinicians are fully aware of the limitations of the current treatments. And for us to have a line of sight forward, for us, in other words, to move the needle for our patients and families, we need to have outside the box thinking. I think that's actually the first part to this. I think the second part to this is that there's increasing recognition that what might be causing or what are the causes of mental disorders may not be specific to mental disorders, maybe overlaps with other conditions like obesity, heart disease, diabetes, inflammatory conditions. And that's opening up a drop-down menu, so to speak, of possibilities that might have some type of explanation for the conditions that we treat in psychiatry. And then I think thirdly, I think there's been some really interesting observational studies that have come out over the years indicating that, for example, dietary manipulation or altered consumption of certain foods may have, maybe in some cases, beneficial or protective effects on the brain. So I think that there's a state of the union, if you will, in psychiatry, but I also think there's been this other sort of robust preclinical literature that's now emerging around the gut-brain axis, that is with animals, that's really aligning very much with some of our hypotheses around humans that maybe in some people, the gut-brain axis may be relevant to why someone is susceptible or declares mental illness, and maybe it might be a direct target of our future treatments.
Well, that is really exciting. Can you tell us a little bit about, maybe define, what is a microbiome exactly?
Yeah, you know, the word microbiome, Andy, and I'm sure you've seen this, it's often used interchangeably with microbiota. Those terms are almost used as synonyms, but they're actually quite different. The microbiota is a word that was coined by a person named Lederberg back in 2001. And the microbiota refers to the totality of all the microorganisms in your gastrointestinal tract. Now, that usually means bacteria, but that's how we usually think about it, but it's not limited to bacteria. It could also include viruses and fungus and so on. But we typically are referring to bacteria, but again, it's more broad than that. The microbiome refers to the totality of the genetic material within the microbiota. So we talk about the human genome, which is our own genetic material. The microbiome is the corollary. It's the totality of all those genes that make up bacteria, virus, fungus, and so on in our gastrointestinal tract. What's important to understate, Andy, about the microbiome is, well, like the genome, the human genome can be modified. The microbiome can be modified as well based on some of the local environment as well as some of the host environment activity. So biome is the genomic material, the biota are the bugs.
Okay, that makes great sense. I've heard the term also dysbyosis. What do we refer to when we're talking about dysbiosis?
Yeah, so dysbiosis generally is defined as a alteration in the signature of your gut biota. So all of us have a gut biota, and it's normal to have gut biota. Just some numbers, Andy. If you ever come out of the shower and you feel like you're really clean, well, I've got some bad news for you. You have about 100 trillion microbes in your gastrointestinal tract. And it's often stated, although there's some debate on this, that we have 10 times more bugs or microbiota than we do human cells. So, it's very significant. So all of us have this in our gastrointestinal tract. That's a normal, what we call biotype. Like your genotype, this is your biotype or enterotype in the gut. So your enterotype is your normal signature. If in fact there's been a change in two areas, either the microbiota diversity has been changed. This diversity is good. That's a theme you're going to hear me come back to. Or you're missing a certain species, or you're seeing less of a certain species. So you can either have decreased diversity or you could have less of a certain species but still retain the diversity. Either one of those, decreased abundance or decreased diversity, or both, is referred to as dysbiosis. And dysbiosis has now been associated with a host of medical and psychiatric disorders.
Can you give me some examples? What kinds of disorders?
Yeah, I mean, where this really, and I remember when I was a medical student, I'm sure you do as well. I remember on my internal medicine rotations, when we saw some particularly older patients on the ward for a variety of reasons, and they would receive antibiotics, and the concern was always about C. difficile infection.
Sure.
And they get an antibiotic, and they were susceptible to C. difficile, which is obviously a very dangerous infection. And that's a great example of how a dysbiosis can lead to a complication. So the antibiotic changed the enterotype. It created a dysbiosis, leaving susceptibility to C. difficile superinfection. It often is nosocomial. It often takes place in hospitals. Other examples of dysbiosis that could lead to medical disorders are in obesity, probably the area of cardiometabolics broadly. So obesity, type 2 diabetes, cardiac disease, a lot's been said about that in its link to dysbiosis. Another area that's a lot been said on, this won't surprise people, is inflammatory bowel disease, Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, a condition that all of us see a lot in our patients, irritable bowel and celiac disease has also been linked. What I think is in fact particularly interesting, which has been emerging lately, is some of the links between dysbiosis and pregnancy-associated hypertension, maybe preeclampsia. There's some emerging data on that. But I think what's interesting is as we round the bases and we start looking at some of these conditions that are linked to dysbiosis, obesity, diabetes, heart disease, this is like the Venn diagram for psychiatry, because many, if not most, of our patients have one or more of these problems. So the phenotype that we have been trained on as mental health care providers is the phenotype of what I call above the neck: depression, bipolar, autism, schizophrenia. But all of us see people below the neck as well. They have obesity, diabetes, heart disease. And interestingly, this is also linked to dysbiosis.
I see. I was fascinated in medical school by the brain-gut connection. I mean, they both evolved from the neural crest, from the same tissue, if you will, during embryogenesis. And some of the same neurotransmitters are used in the brain and the gut. So it's very reasonable to conclude there's a lot of neural connections, but there's also systemic connections through the inflammation system. Can you talk a little bit about that, the inflammatory relationship?
Yeah, it really is interesting because, we were taught as healthcare providers in our training, nursing or medical school or what have you, about the gut-brain axis. And we all know about the so-called gut-brain, in other words, the enteric nervous system, which communicates with the brain through the vagus nerve. And that's well known. And that's why people who have stress often have gastrointestinal symptoms, et cetera, et cetera. But other pathways linking the gut to the brain have been sussed out. And as you mentioned, Andy, both the immune system as well as these extracellular, more endocrine pathways. For example, we know that serotonin is a key neuroactive chemistry. It's an important chemistry implicated in normal and abnormal brain function. In 90% of the body's serotonin production takes place in the gastrointestinal system. So this is
Wow.
one example of a well-known monoamine relevant to brain function, most of it, 90%, produced in the gut. The other part is that the inflammatory piece is really interesting because, as you know, Andy, we've been talking about this a lot, both you and I and many of our colleagues at different meetings and so on, about the potential role that inflammation might be playing in causing some mental disorders, depression, bipolar, many. The question then is, well, how did some people develop inflammation? In other words, why do some people with depression have elevated CRPs, C-reactive peptides? And we humbly say we don't know, but we got some leads. And one of the leads and one of the ideas around this is perhaps in some people, the reason why they have this chronic low-grade inflammation is because they have what's called leaky gut. And leaky gut, in simple conversation speak, is the gut is a wall that is separating the outside world, that is the gut lumen, from the inside world, that being our body. But when there's bacteria dysbyosis, that could disrupt the integrity of the gut. And as a consequence, the internal body is now exposed to bacteria it wouldn't usually be exposed to. For example, there's some studies to show that all of us are learning a lot about antibodies, not just because of its role in psychiatry, but because of some of this incredible pandemic that's taking place around the world. But it would not be normal to find antibodies to certain bacteria, so-called gram-negatives in your gut. One that comes to mind is Pseudomonas aeruginosa. And people have now shown in some studies of people with depression that they're seropositive. They have antibodies to some gram-negatives, which they shouldn't, because they should not have normal. That's not normal to be exposed to those gram-negatives, and those gram-negatives are in your bowel. And so it suggests there's a leakiness going on. The body's exposed to it. That activates, in this case, the humoral system, but there's other innate systems activated. And then the inflammation in response to this exposure then communicates to the brain. And we've seen some really, really interesting data now that systemic inflammation results in central inflammation, leading to things like cognitive impairment or anhedonia or difficulties with mood and sleep and so on.
Well, this is fascinating. The concept that systemic inflammation can get past the blood-brain barrier, for instance, and get into the brain and then have wide-ranging effects is fascinating. I'm reminded again of the current pandemic and the coronavirus. And one of the things we know is that when people do get infected with certain viral infections, there's a certain kind of state that's induced that's not dissimilar from some of the aspects of depression. And so it makes me think that there is this relationship here with inflammation.
I agree with you. And I think all of us would, we've all had the common cold and we know how we felt. We had mood instability or even irritability, and we felt pretty withdrawn and tired and sleep impaired, and our appetites affected. Now, for most of us, that's referred to in animals as a sickness syndrome. And that sickness syndrome is not necessarily equivalent with depression. But interestingly enough, all of those types of phenomenological characteristics make up depression. And I agree with you. It's extremely interesting. And some of the data now that's emerged linking inflammation, not just as a consequence of depression, but actually causing depression, is especially compelling. And it's coming at it from different directions. And it's part of this so-called aseptic inflammation or low-grade chronic inflammation. This is quite different than classic inflammation, where you have a bacteria infect your system, you mount this significant response to it. It's very often very localized. The other way this works is in response to an injury, like tissue injury, things like that, and then it's resolved very quickly. We haven't really evolved to have our immune system activated for weeks, months, and years, and that leads to a whole host of problems that we didn't have before.
Yeah, that's certainly fascinating. I mean, I trained in both internal medicine and psychiatry, and I'll never forget being struck by the significant bidirectional relationship between depression and diabetes, and also depression and cardiovascular disease. And so perhaps there is this explanation, this link here. The classic inflammation, I guess I conceptualize as acute inflammation. And like many other processes in the body, it has a very important biologic function. a significant biologic function. But of course, if this thing goes awry and progresses into chronic inflammation, now we've got a problem here.
It really is. And I think, it's somewhat conversational, but if you think about collateral damage, that's what's going on. And, the scientific community uses the phrase allostatic load just to refer to the wear and tear phenomenon that takes place on the body as a consequence of exposure to activated stress inflammatory systems. And you're right. We've evolved as organisms to fight infection and to heal wounds. And frankly, if you were not successful at doing this in a very short period of time, that would compromise your genetic fitness. Your genes would not be passed on. And so we have not evolved as a species to have the immune inflammatory system to be activated for months and years. And what's interesting is that yes, what you said earlier is so critical, that the immune inflammatory system is there to rid us of infection and to heal our wounds. But chronic low-grade inflammation, that's not actually fighting infection and healing wounds. It's causing disease. It's actually hurting us by causing insulin resistance. It's causing obesity. It's causing heart disease. It's causing psychiatric illness. So it's a very, very different issue. And people have often wondered, how does this work? How is it that if you're exposed to stress, that it activates this inflammatory system? And it's really interesting because there's fairly clear evidence now that if you're under a lot of stress, particularly unpredictable chronic stress, that takes its wear and tear on the cells in your body, and cells are comprised of proteins. And some of these proteins that become exposed because of chronic stress are proteins that are not typically exposed. In other words, we call them damage-associated molecular patterns, better known as DAMPs. Unnecessary long language, but it really is just, I always refer to it. Imagine you're walking by a coffee table, you scratch your leg. Well, what's happening is chronic stress is scratching your cells. It's causing an abrasion on the cell, exposing proteins that are not usually exposed, and then the immune system attacks it. And this is how we link child abuse and how we link social determinants and just chronic stress to inflammation in our patients.
Now, bringing this back to the gut biome, can stress influence the gut biome?
It absolutely can. And this is what's made, I think, interpretation of the gut biota, gut biome, or the gut-brain axis literature very complicated. Because stress itself can change the gut biome or the gut biota. And it does it through a variety of pathways. And related to stress, Andy, it is also apparent that your sleep can affect your gut composition, your enterotype. So patients who come to our office, what do they report? Well, they've got a host of interpersonal stressors or otherwise. They often can't sleep or otherwise, or having difficulties with sleep. Those two factors alone can directly impact the gut enterotype. So when we sample people's fecal material, which we've done in my lab, other labs have done this, and you see dysbiosis, before you get into the discussion, cause and effect here, you have to then say, okay, did the mental illness cause this? Is this resulting? Is this a result of the stress, or did the gut biota changes, the dysbiosis, did it lead to the mental illness? In other words, what came first here, cause and effect?
Of course, it could be bidirectional as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
You just made me think too, when we see people with mental illness, very often they're suffering from poor diet as well. They often don't make as good dietary choices. They'll often go for high carbohydrate, high refined sugar, and things like that. And that's making me think this is going to affect the gut as well.
Absolutely, it does. And that's one of the most replicated observations, not just in animals, but humans, is not just the relationship between diet and diet composition and the enterotype, but also how quickly it can change. One doesn't need to change your diet for weeks and months to change your enterotype. It begins to change immediately. And to your point, literature is clear. Our patients, they overconsume low quality, often very inexpensive, very often high calorie, glycemic rich foods. And this has been shown to significantly reduce either the diversity and or the abundance of certain good guy bugs that are in the GI tract. And it's interesting because when we think about some of the epidemiologic literature showing that, for example, countries that have higher consumption of Mediterranean diets or fish oil diets, they consistently report out a lower incidence of certain mental disorders like depression and bipolar disorder. So it's sort of tempting to speculate that maybe there's something protective about those types of diets. Certainly, there's been lots of work to show that omega-3 consumption results in an enrichment of certain good guy bacteria in your gut, and that might serve as a resiliency for you.
Well, I think everybody listening here is now on the edge of their seat wondering, okay, certainly I can modify my diet. What other kinds of lifestyle choices might have protective effects or anti-inflammatory effects?
I think the big one for us, Andy, in terms of what we're trying to do for our patients, think about smoking. Smoking cigarettes is clearly pro-inflammatory. We all know that about 40% of cigarettes consumed in America are consumed by someone who has a mental illness. So our patients are overrepresented in smokers. Mm-hmm. And smoking has a direct effect on the gut biota. It does create a dysbyosis. Mm-hmm. The other part about this is obesity. We talked about it a moment ago. Yes, obesity is pro-inflammatory, but obesity also changes the enterotype. So it goes both ways. It's bidirectional. The enterotype change can lead to obesity and vice versa. So we think that there are strategies that may be having effects on the enterotype indirectly or directly that are relevant. So getting a good night of sleep, getting exercise, an appropriate diet, stopping smoking, and probably reducing alcohol all have effects on the gut enterotype. The other part that's related, Andy, is the medications that we give patients. And so, I work at a tertiary center. I sometimes see people who are medication naive or are not taking medications at all currently, but they may not be medication naive historically. But many people will be seeing patients for the first time who are medication naive. That's relevant to the concept here because there's a rich literature now that's unfolding showing that many, many medications affect the gut biota. Now, antibiotics, we all know that affects the gut biota, the biome, but psychiatric medications like antipsychotics, antidepressants, lithium, we have a disparate assortment of medications in psychiatry. Many affect the biota. What's really interesting is that there's been work showing, for example, that animals exposed to olanzapine, a well-known antipsychotic, very effective antipsychotic in psychosis and mania, but we all know it causes a lot of metabolic problems and obesity-related problems. And interestingly enough, olanzapine affects bacteria in the bowel of animals that are relevant to metabolism. So it's possible that one of the mechanisms, I don't think it's the only mechanism, but one of the mechanisms where olanzapine could be directly affecting glucose-insulin homeostasis or obesity in our patients might be through the gut that is affecting the enterotype.
Well, that is fascinating. What you're making me think is that in addition to our traditional medications, of course, we need to prescribe these diet and lifestyle choices we're talking about, but it also makes me wonder about soon we may have information on the choice of the medications and their relationship to the gut biota. I'm also wondering, too, about various interventions that have to do with prebiotics and probiotics. So maybe you can just quickly review what is the difference between a prebiotic and a probiotic?
Yeah, and that's really important. And I think, when we think about biotics, I think antibiotics, is self-explanatory. Everyone knows what that is. A prebiotic is really, in fact, a substance that promotes the growth of other bacteria. In other words, I happen to particularly like Korean food. Kimchi is something I really, really like. Kimchi is a carbohydrate. It's fermented cabbage, and it really is a powerful prebiotic. So foodstuffs that promote the growth of bacteria, often carbohydrate type products, can really act as prebiotics. That's different than probiotics. And probiotics is actually when you take bacteria. For example, if you had yogurt for breakfast one day, you're taking probably probiotic in there. They have biotic right in there. Mm-hmm. So if you ingest bacteria, that is probiotic, and many drinks and so on are supplemented with this kind of thing. And prebiotics are substances that promote the growth of bacteria. So we get pre, pro, and anti. And just around the bases on that, Andy, is we have fecal transplantation. Now, we're not talking about fecal matter transplantation, FMT, as a treatment for psychiatric illness at the current time. This type of thing seemed outlandish 10, 20 years ago. It certainly wasn't outlandish 100, 200 years ago. I think it's a bit of coming back to the future, because this is how many diseases were treated years ago through fecal transplantation in the history of medicine. But it's interesting that fecal matter transplantation has become a treatment of choice for C. difficile infection. I mean, you would never have dreamed that up. I would never thought of that when I was in medical school.
No.
And it's become apparently the treatment of choice in some circles. Now, there are some safety concerns with it, and the FDA has been following that. But now there's over 100 studies on clinicaltrials.gov where investigators are trying to determine, can fecal matter transplantation, which is the ultimate enterotype replacement, can that offer some type of benefit against condition X, Y, or Z? There's so many conditions being looked at, ranging from diabetes, obesity, autism, cancer, you name it. And what's really kind of cool about this, Andy, and I know you know this well, is that where, in fact, the reason to believe was really provided is some of the animal work where they took human feces from people who were experiencing depression and from healthy control human beings, and fed the fecal material to rodents. And the rodents, when they ingested the fecal material from healthy control humans, I mean, there were no difference in how they behaved in their cages and so on, in some of the other biochemical analysis that were done on the animals. But when the animals actually consumed fecal material from depressed human beings, they became depressed. They actually became immobilized. They were cognitively impaired. They had biochemical changes. Yeah, so I think when we're thinking about biotic, exogenous biotics, we're now talking about pre, pro, and anti, but we're also now thinking about FMT.
Well, I think a slightly more palatable intervention, of course, would be prebiotics and probiotics. Is there any,
I think so.
Is there any literature on prebiotics and probiotics in mental illness?
There are data sets now looking at prebiotics and probiotics as treatments for people who have, for example, depression. And just as a reminder, and Andy, I know you know this well, but for everyone joining us today, there's different rigors or different levels of rigor that we assign to this science. And what we really like when we're attempting to synthesize data and have a compelling storyline is, has the data been randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled? Have these data been, in fact, subjected to peer review? And have they been meta-analyzed? I want to start off with that because this literature in general is, I would say, is still in its infancy.
Yeah.
We had some really interesting studies that came out initially, and these studies exist, they're very promising, where individuals who, for example, were healthy controls, they don't have depression, they're healthy controls, and they take a prebiotic drink. Now, they're taking a prebiotic drink or a sham drink. They don't know they're taking the prebiotic. And while these people within the study, an MRI scan is done. And so these are folks who are blinded. They don't know they're taking the prebiotic drink. They're healthy controls. And the prebiotic drink began to change some of the brain metabolism in these people, as witnessed on the MRI. That's a very compelling story because these individuals are blinded. And there's a couple of studies out there now that's replicated that finding. That is that taking a fermented drink or a prebiotic drink can change brain metabolism in response to, for example, a task, a cognitive emotional task while you're in the MRI scan. Very compelling as a concept. How does this translate into studies where depressed people take the prebiotic and the outcome, or probiotic, and the outcome is to alleviate depression symptom severity? I would say we have leads. I've looked at this literature carefully over the years. I follow it very carefully. There's some suggestions. Certainly, we're seeing no evidence that it's worsening depression. Let's start off with that. We haven't seen cases where it's induced mania, which I think is conceptually interesting, not just a safety observation. But there's some hints that it works. But I'm going to be a little bit ruthless on this one. The quality of the data, frankly, I'm going to give it a B, Andy, probably even a B- in terms of how some of these studies are done. And when these studies have been meta-analyzed, if you meta-analyze average to below average studies, by definition, the meta-analysis can't be better than average. Mm-hmm. And so the meta-analysis are suggesting that it could work, pre and probiotics. But for example, some of these studies didn't even have people who had DSM-5 defined depression. Yeah. They had, they used different rating scales and so on. So I think that before we can convince ourselves that prebiotics, probiotics have got across the threshold as being effective, I think we need to see more rigorous evidence. And I haven't seen that just yet. But maybe, in fact, there's something that's maybe a bit more compelling, and that might be minocycline. Mm-hmm. And Andy, I know you know this very well. Minocycline, it's an antibiotic. It's part of the, it's a tetracycline type molecule. And if one was to do a literature search and look at randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trials in depression, bipolar, schizophrenia, they're going to see some studies positive for minocycline, rigorous studies. Mm-hmm. We did a study a number of years ago. It was not a randomized control study. It was an open label study, but we were looking at inflammatory markers in bipolar depressed patients who took minocycline. And minocycline, for colleagues who are listening, is not only that it's an antibiotic, but it's also a drug that gets into the brain and acts as a microglial stabilizer, which is what lithium does as well, by the way. And microglia are the macrophages of the brain. And minocycline, in a meta-analysis, has shown signal of efficacy in depression. So if I was to say, what's the state of the union in terms of the science here, we've got probably a stronger signal for minocycline than we do for the pre and probiotics, at least based on the rigor of the data right now.
Yeah, but certainly it sounds like pre and probiotics might help, but are unlikely to hurt. Yeah. And certainly they may have more generalized health benefits as well. So this is certainly embryonic, but emerging science and exciting because of the low toxicity.
I agree.
Let's shift gears a little bit. We're talking about the gut microbiome. There's a specific gut bacteria, Flavonofractor, if I'm saying it correctly. Yeah. And I understand there's a relationship with this particular bacteria and bipolar illness. And this may be one of those bad bacteria that can overgrow. Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. We talked about the dysbyosis being defined as either a change in the diversity of the microorganisms and or a change in the abundance of one particular species. And Flavonofractor is a bacterial genus that's well known to be associated with inflammation and oxidative stress. There was a really interesting study that some colleagues did where they looked at a well-characterized group of people with bipolar disorder, and then they compared that group to an at-risk group. An at-risk group is an unaffected first-degree relative as well as healthy controls. And the strength of this conceptually, and I know you know this, is that when you have a study that's comparing a patient population to a healthy controls, that's a very clear conceptual framework. And then you're always left with this question that we got into earlier, what's cause and effect? Because the mental illness itself is associated with behaviors and treatments that could affect the gut. But if you use an unaffected first-degree relative, that controls for some of these other possible considerations because this person is genetically related, probably shares some environment, etc. What investigators found is that in adults with bipolar disorder, there was a relative excess of this bad guy bacteria, the Flavonofractor, relative to healthy controls. And the at-risk group was sort of intermediate, somewhere in the middle, so to speak. The takeaway being is that I think from a methodological perspective, this type of design is more compelling. And it extends, Andy, further into a really interesting study a colleague of mine did in Denmark named Maj Vinberg. And they looked at monozygotic twins. I mean, this is really interesting because we all know that bipolar disorder is highly heritable, and the range of heritability has, been reported, 40 up to 80%. Most studies come in around 60 to 80%. Everyone knows that. And what's interesting is that when you conduct a genome-wide association study looking for so-called GWAS studies, looking for the genetic architecture of bipolar, genetic experts are really frustrated because when they look at some of the what they call polygenic risk scores, which is some of these sort of quantitative ways they look at risk alleles, they just can't make the math add up. And this is what's referred to as the missing heritability. In other words, that difference between what the genetics is accounting for versus what something else is accounting for. So is there something else that's passed on? You're passing on not just your genetics to your offspring and and so on, but maybe you're also passing off some of your bacteria. So what Lawrence Vinberg's team did, they looked at monozygotic twins. One has bipolar, the other one does not have bipolar. And it's really interesting because what they found is that in people who had bipolar disorder, that group was actually missing or had a relative decrease in a good guy bacteria called Kristin-Sellisae. Kristin-Sellisae has beneficial effects on metabolism. The unaffected monozygotic twin did not have the same degree of missing of this particular bacteria, but the healthy controls had lots of it. So it's really interesting. So this dysbyosis, you're either missing a specific good guy, or you've got too much of maybe a bad guy, and or you have a change in diversity. And this is very compelling conceptually.
Certainly is. That's further evidence of a linkage, again, between our mental illnesses and various metabolic disorders when you're talking about the metabolic activity of gut bacteria.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
We talked briefly about the effects of stress. We talk a lot now about the importance of early life adversity, or ELA. And we know that ELA can affect stress levels. It can affect the epigenetics and turn on or off genes that stay that way for long periods of time. I'm wondering if it also can affect the gut microbiota.
Absolutely. Andy, when you and I were training in medical school, early life adversity usually meant childhood and adolescence. Now we talk about early life adversity in utero, in being exposed to, for example, when the fetus is exposed to malnutrition or infection and things like that. And we know there's a story unfolded that second trimester exposure to infection or malnutrition, certain types of infections, could increase the risk for the offspring of a selection of mental disorders. But there are data now to show that in animals that are in their infancy, so rodents, mice and rats, early in their development, when they are subjected to adversity, their gut biome changes and biota changes. That leads to a host of behavioral changes in these animals as they age. There certainly are now in human samples looking at measures of stress and association now between stress, not just recent stress, but the reporting of childhood adversity and perhaps changes in the enterotype. Scientifically, those studies are a little tough to interpret because let's say you're 35 years old today and you were exposed to childhood adversity at age 10, that's a long time and a lot's happened there. So I'm still struggling myself to sort of connect those dots. But there's no question that stress that happened, for example, in the last day or two, that's also been shown to affect your gut enterotype. So absolutely, it's there, it's replicated, and maybe playing some type of role in what you and I are trying to prevent and treat.
Yeah. One of the themes here that I'm taking from this is that these changes can be induced a lot faster than we might think. And so these kinds of interventions are not things that are going to take weeks, months, years, as we sometimes worry about with some of our traditional treatments. And certainly, again, these are things we're talking about to prescribe, if you will, to our patients that are relatively low risk, but should be thought about as part of the holistic care of our patients as we seek to get to a state not only of decreased symptoms, but of wellness and resilience. I want to shift gears for a quick second. I want to bring us back to the current state of affairs and the COVID-19 pandemic across the world. There was a recent study published in JAMA, and it reported that out of 72,314 cases of COVID-19, and this is in China, patients who had diabetes had a 3-fold higher mortality rate than those without diabetes. And we've certainly been hearing that people with pre-existing and underlying conditions are at higher risk here with this infection. How do you think that relationship manifests? And do you think that there's a role for the microbiome here, even influencing immunity and recovery from illness?
It's an amazing line of inquiry, and you're right, that has been observed, and we've also been hearing some of the early reports, for example, from some states like Louisiana, that African American populations may be more susceptible to mortality. And when we look into that group, we know there's an overrepresentation of diabetes type 2 and obesity and cardiac disease. Taken together, there is a story that could be relevant here. For example, we know that each of these conditions is highly associated with inflammation and highly associated with immune dysregulation. That's well established for all these conditions. Moreover, all these conditions are overrepresented in many of our patients with schizophrenia and depression and bipolar. Andy, one of the questions I'm extremely interested in, I know you would be as well, is once this thing is behind us and we all look forward to that, are persons who have mental illness more susceptible as well to this? In part, yes, because they have many of the conditions that we enumerated, but also just by having a mental illness, you have a higher rate of immune dysregulation. So we'll need to find that out once we have more data. But I do think the question is interesting because it could possibly be the case that the immune alterations in these populations that have diabetes, obesity, cardiac disease could in part be a consequence of changes in the gut bacteria, the gut biome. Absolutely. It's a very, very interesting thought. Certainly, this is going to be looked at, of course, once we have more data, but it's a tantalizing consideration. Certainly, I think that the experts in this area seem to have agreement that there's something about these chronic diseases that not only compromise your breathing and so on, which is relevant, of course. If you're trying to fight the virus, you can't breathe and you're obese and you're diabetic. There's that mechanical piece, but there may also be the immune piece, which could be linked to the biome biota.
Well, this is certainly fascinating. Well, this has been a wide-ranging and very important discussion talking about the relationship between the brain and the gut, and particularly the microbiome. We've talked about the relationship with inflammation. Roger, I wonder if you wouldn't mind just kind of summarizing for the clinicians out there who are listening, what are some of the clinical pearls, the clinical real take-home points that maybe we should start incorporating into our practice today, or that we can keep an eye on for something that may be right around the bend that might change the way we practice?
I think for me, the takeaway, at least this literature and how it's really affected my practice clinically, is as follows. I have become very deliberate around the importance of education on diet. It seems very basic, but it's so relevant. A healthy diet has shown to benefit biodiversity in the gut. It's also been shown to be beneficial for other reasons. More work is needed, Andy, with respect to ketogenic diets, Mediterranean diets, supplemented diets, et cetera, et cetera. We'll learn more in the next 3 to 5 years. So the diet piece is critical. Secondly, I think clinically, all of us know the importance of exercise, sleep, and stress management. No one is unaware of that. But what I would argue is perhaps in part for some of these people who are benefiting from these well-known, very basic strategies, perhaps the avenue, the pathway where it could be beneficial, perhaps in some, is through the bowel. Now, the third and final point is, and I tell all my students this, don't say more research is needed. We all know more research is needed. What I think is really, for me, critical is I don't think we could say that prebiotics and probiotics have demonstrated unequivocal efficacy in mental illness. That would be, I think, going beyond the data just yet, although the leads are very promising from what we talked about that. There is a story unfolding that perhaps in some people in tertiary mood disorder centers, I prescribe minocycline for some of my patients with depression. Again, that's not a first, second, third, or fourth line therapy. So I think clinically, yes, the strategies that we talk about, we all know are relevant to good chronic disease management. But I think stay tuned to this literature because I do suspect we're going to see some interesting findings around pre and probiotics in the next 3 to 5 years.
Well, I certainly hope so. And, one of the things, Roger, you taught me this years ago, that weight loss by any means is an antidepressant treatment. And in other fields of medicine, it strikes me that we have targets. If we're treating diabetes, we have a certain glucose target. If we're treating hypertension, we want the blood pressure under 120/80. We haven't had good targets in psychiatry, but I think one that has clearly emerged is a BMI of 30. That if we can get people's BMI under 30, and certainly healthy diet and exercise is one way to do that, that we decrease the risk of depression and we increase the chances that they'll respond to our treatments. Is that not so?
Absolutely. And, I think that there's a fairly superficial notion that if you lose weight, you feel better about yourself. And of course, who doesn't? It's a bit more complicated than that. And we know that obesity does metastasize to the brain. And in other words, the inflammation, some of the changes in insulin signaling, as well as the oxidative stress that accompanies obesity are all hazardous to normal brain function. And the literature shows, and where this is really compelling is in the bariatric surgery literature, is if you lose a lot of weight, not only does it have beneficial effects on mood and well-being, but also is pro-cognitive, another dimension of depression. And it conceptually speaks to how hazardous some of the consequences of obesity are on the normal brain function, but also speaks to the opportunity. And I have to say, when I started as a psychiatrist, in my career, I started a mood disorder center. I'm a pharmacologist, and that's how I saw the world. And I guess I've evolved over time. You go with where your patients take you. And I would never have anticipated that as a psychiatrist today, that I really spend as much time as I do speaking about lifestyle. It seems basic, but it is so critical and has been shown to be so brain therapeutic.
Absolutely. And I think any good clinician, when treating any illness, for instance, if we're treating diabetes, we don't just give insulin. Of course, we talk about diet and lifestyle changes. And I think it's just, again, part of state-of-the-art care should be incorporating these things that we're talking about into the treatment of your patients.
Completely agree.
Well, Roger, I really want to thank you. This has been a wide-ranging and fascinating discussion. I want to wrap it up now, and I want to tell people, stay tuned. We'll have further podcasts in the future on various topics of interest. And thank you so much for spending some time with us today, learning more about gut microbiome and the brain-gut interaction. Thanks, Roger.
Thanks, Andy. Always enjoyable to have these discussions with you, and thanks for all for joining us.
Thank you for your participation in this NEI CME podcast episode. To receive your certificate of CME credit, please refer to this podcast's description page for a link to go online and print your certificate. This concludes the CME podcast presentation.